January 17, 1946. Yokohama Harbor, Japan. The winter wind cut across the gray waters of Tokyo Bay, carrying with it the salt of Pacific and the ash of a nation still smoldering from defeat. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto stood at attention on the rain-slicked dock, his worn Imperial Army uniform pressed as sharp as rationed fabric would allow. Behind him, 73 wooden caskets lay in perfect rows, each draped with white cloth bearing no insignia, no rising sun, just the stark anonymity of the vanquished dead. These were Japanese officers and soldiers who had died in American prisoner war camps, men whose bodies were being returned to a homeland that barely recognized itself anymore. Yamamoto's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the hilt of his ceremonial sword, surrendered months ago but returned to him for this singular purpose, to receive the dead with whatever dignity defeat had left intact. The American LSD groaned as it maneuvered toward the dock, its hull painted the same industrial gray as the sky. Yamamoto had expected many things from the occupation forces: efficiency, perhaps coldness, maybe even contempt. He had been taught for years that the Americans were soft, materialistic, lacking the spiritual fortitude of the Yamato race. Even in defeat, even standing among the ruins of imperial ideology, some part of him clung to the belief that there would be a fundamental difference in how these Western victors understood honor, death, and the weight of a warrior's final journey home. What he did not expect, what no amount of military intelligence or propaganda had prepared him for, was what happened when that ramp descended and the first casket appeared. 6 American soldiers, all enlisted men, bore the first casket down the ramp with deliberate slowness. Their boots struck the metal in perfect rhythm. But it was not the precision that seized Yamamoto's breath. It was the moment they reached the dock, the moment they turned toward him and the assembled Japanese officers, and the moment every single American soldier bowed. Not a casual nod, not a perfunctory gesture, but a deep, formal bow, the kind that required him to set the casket down gently, step back, place hands at their sides, and bend at the waist until their eyes faced the ground. They held it. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Long enough that it couldn't be dismissed as procedural, long enough that it became something else entirely. Yamamoto felt something crack inside his chest, some calcified certainty he hadn't known he was still carrying. To understand the weight of that bow, one must first understand what the Japanese military had spent decades constructing, an entire cosmology of death. Since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the Imperial Japanese military had synthesized ancient samurai ethics with modern nationalist fervor, creating a doctrine where death in service of the emperor was not merely honorable, it was the highest possible expression of human existence. The Senjinkin, the military field code issued in 1941, explicitly stated, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a bad name." This wasn't battlefield rhetoric. This was ontology. To be captured was to cease existing as a full human being in the eyes of the empire. The Allied prisoners whom Japan took during its Pacific expansion, the British at Singapore, the Americans at Bataan and Corregidor, the Dutch in the East Indies, became, in Japanese military logic, a category of non-being. They had chosen captivity over death. They had failed the fundamental test of martial spirit. The fact that they had been ordered to surrender by their own commands, that military doctrine outside Japan's borders didn't prescribe suicide as a response to encirclement, was irrelevant. The Japanese treatment of POWs flowed directly from this metaphysical contempt: forced labor on the Thai-Burma Railway, starvation rations, medical neglect, summary executions for infractions as minor as stealing food. Of the approximately 140,000 Allied POWs held by Japan, nearly 27% died in captivity, a rate almost 7 times higher than that of Allied POWs held by Germany. But the doctrine cut both ways. When Japan's own soldiers were captured, usually while unconscious from wounds, unable to complete the suicide their training demanded, they faced a peculiar ontological crisis. They were dead to their homeland, non-persons who had failed the primary duty. Some, broken by this realization, collaborated with Allied intelligence, believing they had nothing left to preserve. Others retreated into silence, waiting for an execution they believed was both deserved and inevitable. Almost none expected to be treated as prisoners of war in the Western legal sense, as human beings temporarily deprived of liberty, possessing rights under international law, deserving of medical care and adequate food. What actually happened in American POW camps constituted a form of ideological violence more profound than any bayonet could achieve. The camps themselves were paradoxes wrapped in barbed wire. Take Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, which held Japanese prisoners beginning in 1943. The base had been built for American military training, then repurposed with guard towers and fencing, but the fundamental infrastructure remained: wooden barracks with heating, communal mess halls, recreational facilities, a camp hospital with actual medicine and trained physicians. The American military, bound by the Geneva Convention and its own logistical abundance, applied the same systematic efficiency to prisoner welfare that it applied to everything else. Japanese prisoners received the same daily caloric intake as American troops in training, approximately 3,600 calories, a figure that seemed obscene to men who had watched their own military feed frontline soldiers on 1,800 calories while waging total war. Private Hiroshi Nakamura, captured on Saipan in July 1944 after a grenade blast rendered him unconscious, later wrote in his repatriation testimony, "I woke believing I was in the antechamber of hell, awaiting torture. Instead, they gave me food. Not scraps, food. Rice, meat, vegetables. I ate until I vomited, not from poison but from shock. My stomach had forgotten what sufficiency felt like. The food became the first crack in the edifice. The imperial military had taught that American wealth made them weak, that their soldiers were pampered children who would crumble under the spiritual superiority of Japanese bushido. But the camps revealed a different possibility. What if abundance created its own kind of strength? What if a nation that could feed its prisoners as well was operating under a logic so foreign that all the pre-war assumptions were not just wrong, but incoherent? The second crack came from the labor policies. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be assigned work, but not military production, and they had to be paid. The Americans, with their obsessive legalism, paid Japanese POWs in camp scrip, worthless outside the wire but exchangeable inside for toiletries, cigarettes, candy, even small luxuries. The work itself was often agricultural, harvesting crops in the Midwest, clearing forests in the Northwest. Hard physical labor, yes, but accompanied by rest breaks, water, and a foreman who, more often than not, seemed more concerned with efficiency than humiliation. Sergeant Kenji Tokahashi, captured in the Philippines, described working a lumber detail in Montana. The American guard, a man perhaps 50 years old, too old for combat, shared his lunch with us. Not leftovers, half his sandwich, from his own hands. He spoke no Japanese. We spoke no English, but he showed us photographs of his sons, both in uniform. One was dead, killed in France. He showed us this while sitting beside us, eating together. I could not reconcile this with what we had been told about American barbarism. If this was propaganda, it was propaganda of sophistication we had never encountered. The education program represented the third assault on certainty. The U.S. military, with the confidence of unquestioned victors and a peculiar missionary zeal about democracy, offered Japanese prisoner classes: English language, American history, civics. Attendance was voluntary. Thousands attended, not because they suddenly loved their captors, but because the alternative was sitting in a barracks confronting the fact that they were alive when they had been taught they should be dead, fighting a war that was clearly, inexorably being lost. In these classes, Japanese officers and enlisted men encountered American instructors, often to say, second-generation Japanese Americans, who presented a version of history and governance that did not depend on divine emperors or racial destiny. They learned about the Constitution, about checks and balances, about the idea that government derived legitimacy from the consent of the governed rather than from cosmic bloodlines. Some dismissed it as victors' propaganda. Others felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. By late 1944, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, some Japanese POWs in American custody were writing letters to relatives back home, letters the censors read but often allowed through, describing conditions that sounded less like imprisonment and more like a bizarre form of sanctuary. These letters rarely made it through the Japanese military postal system, which had its own reasons for suppressing any suggestion that capture was survivable, even mundane. But the most profound transformation wasn't happening in the camps themselves. It was happening in the minds of men who had been taught that capture meant ontological erasure, and who were instead being treated as if they were still human beings with dignity, rights, and futures. When death came to the camps, from illness, from wounds that proved too severe, from the occasional suicide by men who could not integrate the cognitive dissonance, the Americans did something that made no sense within the imperial Japanese framework. They cared for the bodies. Captain John Morrison, a Protestant chaplain stationed at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, kept detailed records of Japanese prisoner deaths. "We treated them exactly as we would treat our own dead," he wrote in a letter to his bishop in March 1945. "Respectful handling, documentation, whatever religious rites we could manage given our ignorance of Shinto and Buddhist practices. We brought in a Buddhist priest from San Francisco to conduct services for 2 men who died in the camp hospital. We erected markers. We maintained records so that, should the day come when these men could be returned home, their families would know where they had lain and how they had been treated." This was an official policy in the sense of specific Geneva Convention requirements. The convention mandated respectful treatment, but didn't prescribe the level of care Morrison described. This was American civil religion expressing itself. The idea that death deserved dignity regardless of the uniform the deceased had worn, that there was something sacred in the human person that transcended nationality. It was the same impulse that had driven Americans to build elaborate military cemeteries across Europe, to meticulously record the names of the dead, to send personal effects home to mothers who lived on farms in Kansas and had never seen an ocean. The Japanese prisoners noticed. Not all of them. Some remained locked in the old certainties until repatriation and beyond. But enough noticed to create a cohort of men who returned to Japan carrying a secret knowledge. The enemy we demonized treated us better than our own military treated us. Corporal Masao Ito, who spent 18 months at a camp in Texas, later testified before American occupation officials. "When my bunkmate died of pneumonia, the camp commander attended his funeral. An officer, he stood in the cold, with no requirement to be there, while a Japanese flag, the one we were allowed to sew from camp materials, covered the coffin. I expected desecration. I received reverence. How do you return from that unchanged?" The war ended with atomic fire and unconditional surrender. The emperor, whose divinity had been the axis around which the entire structure of meaning rotated, spoke on the radio in August 1945 and told his subject to endure the unendurable. For a military that had preached death over surrender for 70 years, the surrender of the entire nation created a psychic catastrophe more profound than the physical destruction of the cities. Everything had been inverted. The dead were the fools. The living were confronted with the task of constructing new reasons for breathing. The repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese military personnel scattered across the Pacific, in China, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, began the journey home. Among them were the men held in American POW camps, and with them came the bodies of those who had died in custody. The American military, in a logistical operation that received little public attention but consumed significant resources, prepared these remains for return. Caskets were constructed. Bodies were embalmed where possible, or cremated where time and condition demanded. Records were compiled. The same bureaucratic machinery that had defeated the Imperial Japanese military now turned itself to the task of returning their dead with honor. There was debate within the U.S. military about the procedure. Some officers argued for simple efficiency: stack the caskets, load the ships, turn them over to Japanese officials at the dock. Others, perhaps those who had served as camp administrators, who had overseen the strange daily interactions between captor and captured, who had watched prisoners transform from fanatics to human beings with doubts and questions, argued for something more. Dignity, they insisted, was not expensive. It cost nothing but time and intentionality. The decision came from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. The supreme commander for the Allied powers, whatever his personal vanities and political ambitions, understood the theater of occupation. Japan would be rebuilt, not just physically but psychologically. Every interaction between American forces and the Japanese population was a brick in the foundation of whatever post-war relationship would emerge. The repatriation of remains would be conducted with full military honors, which meant the bow. Yamamoto watched as casket after casket descended from the LST, each accompanied by 6 American soldiers, each transfer punctuated by that deep, formal bow. 73 caskets. 73 bows. The Americans were methodical, their movements practiced. This was an improvised respect. This was protocol, which meant someone had written orders specifying exactly how this would be done, which meant someone in authority had decided this mattered. Beside him, Major Katsuo Tanaka, who had spent the war in China and come home to find his family's estate in ruins and his certainty shattered, whispered, "They bow deeper than many of our own officers did." It was true. The American soldiers, most of them young, probably 19 or 20, men who had been in high school when Pearl Harbor was attacked, were executing a formal bow that would have satisfied the strictest pre-war military academy instructor. Someone had taught them. Someone had drilled them. Someone had said, "This is how we honor the dead, even the enemy dead, because death itself demands this." The Japanese officers had prepared brief remarks, formal acknowledgments to be delivered to the American officer in charge. But when Captain Robert Chen, a Nisei officer from Seattle who spoke fluent Japanese, approached with a transfer of documents, Yamamoto found himself unable to speak. Chen, seeming to understand, simply bowed another deep, formal bow and said in perfect Japanese, "We return these men to their homeland and to their families. They were treated with all the honor we could provide. We hope this brings some measure of peace." Yamamoto managed a bow in return, deeper than he'd intended, and felt wetness on his cheeks that he initially attributed to the harbor mist before realizing it was something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, as those 73 bodies were claimed by families and cremated according to Buddhist and Shinto rites, stories began to circulate. Stories about how the Americans had treated the remains, about the bows, about the precision and care. These stories moved through a society desperate for meaning in the rubble, a population trying to understand how the unthinkable had happened, how the divine nation had been reduced to ash and occupation. Some dismissed it as propaganda, Victor's magnanimity designed to pacify the conquered. But others, particularly those who had family members returned from American POW camps, heard different stories. Stories about food, about medical care, about American guards who shared cigarettes and showed photographs of their own families. These stories didn't fit the narrative of American barbarism that had sustained the war effort. They suggested something more disturbing, that the enemy had been more humane than the empire itself. Private Yoshiro Sasaki, repatriated from a camp in Arkansas, told his mother, "I ate better as a prisoner than I ever did in the Imperial Army. They gave us meat 3 times a week." Meat! While our soldiers in the Philippines were eating grass and bark, the Americans fed their prisoners like valued livestock. He meant it as a criticism of the empire, not praise for the Americans. But his mother heard the implication. If America could feed its prisoners as well while fighting a war on 2 continents, what did that say about the relative strength of the 2 systems? The symbolism of the bow became a reference point, a shorthand for something larger. In a culture where the bow was a primary nonverbal expression of respect, hierarchy, and social relationship, the image of American soldiers bowing to Japanese caskets carried devastating freight. It suggested that the Americans understood the language of honor, that they had chosen to speak it fluently when they could have remained silent, that their victory had not erased their capacity for recognizing the humanity of the defeated. This was not the behavior of spiritually inferior materialists. This was a behavior of people who had internalized a different understanding of what human dignity meant. One not dependent on victory, not contingent on national identity, but somehow intrinsic to existence itself. The occupation years deepened the transformation. The Americans arrived with their jazz and their chewing gum, their casual egalitarianism that scandalized the class-conscious Japanese, their women in uniform giving orders to men. But they also arrived with food, tons upon tons of food distributed through relief programs that prevented mass starvation in the devastated cities. They arrived with a constitution written in English and translated into Japanese, stripping the emperor of divinity and sovereignty, vesting power in the people. They arrived with plans for land reform, for zaibatsu dissolution, for democratization. The Japanese people, exhausted and hungry, observed. The communist sympathizers expected revolution. The old guard expected chaos and vindication of their warnings about Western degeneracy. Instead, what emerged was stranger, a functional democracy grafted onto a devastated empire, fertilized by American money and enforced by American troops who, by and large, treated the occupation as a job to be done competently rather than as an opportunity for revenge. Former prisoners of war found themselves in a peculiar position. They had seen behind the curtain. They knew what American captivity looked like from the inside, which meant they knew that the official propaganda about American torture and brutality had been lies. Some kept this knowledge private, sensing that the society around them wasn't ready to hear it. Others spoke carefully, selectively, planting seeds of doubt about the old order. Yamamoto, the officer who had received the caskets at Yokohama, spent the occupation years working in the newly formed Japanese government's Ministry of Health and Welfare. He never spoke publicly about the bow, but he carried it with him, the memory of those young American soldiers, probably farm boys and factory workers before the war, bending at the waist with studied precision to honor men they had every right to hate. In 1951, when the San Francisco Peace Treaty formally ended the occupation, Yamamoto wrote a private letter to Captain Chen, the Nisei officer who had overseen the transfer. The letter was formal, circumspect, but it contained one line that revealed the depth of the transformation. You taught me that honor was not the exclusive possession of any single culture, and that defeat could coexist with dignity. Chen kept the letter in his personal papers. When he died in 1983, his daughter found it and donated it to the Japanese-American National Museum in Los Angeles, where it remains in the collection, a small artifact of a large reckoning. The bow, in the end, was a weapon more powerful than the Enola Gay's payload. The atomic bomb destroyed cities and killed thousands, forcing the surrender through sheer terror and overwhelming force. But the bow destroyed certainty. It demolished a careful ideological architecture that had sustained imperial Japanese militarism. It suggested that the enemy might be not just stronger, but better, not morally superior in some abstract sense, but operating under a system that produced superior outcomes for human flourishing, even for the humans it was fighting. This was the unbearable knowledge that men like Yamamoto carried home from the harbor that gray January day. The war had been lost not just militarily but philosophically. The Americans had defeated Japan with bombs and ships and industrial might, yes, but they had also defeated the ideas that made Imperial Japan cohere. They had done so not through ideological argument, but through practice, through the daily, mundane application of principles that treated even enemy prisoners as human beings with rights, that fed them and housed them and returned their dead with honor. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse and a stable democracy, the question haunted the post-war generation: what had the empire been fighting for? The official wartime answer, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, liberation from Western colonialism, preservation of the Yamato race, all of it rang hollow against the memory of American abundance and American mercy. The soldiers who came home from American camps, who had been fed better as prisoners than as warriors, knew a secret that slowly became common knowledge. The system had failed them long before the surrender. The irony was almost too perfect. Japan had gone to war believing its spiritual culture was superior to Western materialism, that its warriors' willingness to die would overcome the enemy's weakness. Instead, Western materialism had produced a system so abundant it could feed its enemies, so confident it could treat prisoners with dignity, so secure in its values that it could bow to the dead of a defeated foe. The spiritual nation had starved its own soldiers and taught them to die uselessly. The materialist nation had kept them alive and sent them home. In 1952, Corporal Masao Ito, the man who had watched an American camp commander attend his bunkmate's funeral, stood in Hiroshima and looked at the ruins that were already being rebuilt. The Americans were gone now, the occupation formally over, sovereignty nominally restored. Japan was independent again, responsible for its own destiny. Ito had a choice to make about what story he would tell himself about the previous decade, about the war, about his captivity, about the nation that had taught him to die and the enemy nation that had taught him he could live. He thought about the food. The ridiculous abundance of food in that Texas camp, the way the American cooks had sometimes made special meals on holidays, the way they'd accommodated Japanese prisoners' complaints about too much bread and not enough rice. He thought about the classes, the patient Nisei instructors explaining democratic theory to men who had been raised to believe the emperor was a living god. He thought about the small kindnesses, the guard who had given him extra blankets during a cold snap, the medic who had spent hours treating his infected wound with antibiotics that the Imperial Army would never have wasted on an enlisted man. And he thought about the bodies being carried down that ramp, and the Americans bowing like it mattered, like these dead soldiers who had lost everything including their nation's respect still deserved to be honored in death. Ito made his choice. He would remember it all. the brutality of the imperial military, the lies of the propaganda, the shock of American mercy. He would tell his children, when they were old enough to understand, that the war had been a catastrophe born of bad ideas pursued with fatal conviction. And he would tell them about the bow, about the way the enemy had known something his own commanders had forgotten, that human beings, even in death, even in defeat, possess a dignity that no war could erase. The lesson took decades to fully integrate into Japanese consciousness. The post-war years were complicated, marked by anti-American protests and complex feelings about the occupation, about Article 9 and the Security Treaty, about the ways Japan had been remade by outside forces. But beneath the political arguments, a quieter transformation continued. The generation that had fought the war and survived, that had been prisoners or guards or civilians in the burned cities, carried private knowledge about the old order's failures and the strange mercy of the victors. By the time Yamamoto died in 1978, Japan had become one of the world's most prosperous democracies, its military domesticated into a self-defense force, its emperors stripped of divinity but preserved as cultural symbols, its society rebuilt on principles that would have been unthinkable in 1941. Whether this represented American imperialism or Japanese pragmatism or some combination thereof remained debated. But the concrete fact persisted. The system had changed, and the change had produced peace and prosperity that the empire had never delivered. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, the Japanese government opened a small museum dedicated to the experiences of Japanese POWs in Allied custody. The museum was controversial. Some saw it as unnecessary Western-focused historical revisionism, others as a long-overdue acknowledgement of a suppressed story. But among the exhibits was a photograph, black and white and slightly blurred, showing American soldiers unloading caskets from a ship at Yokohama Harbor in 1946. The photo didn't show the bow. It had been taken from the wrong angle. But the accompanying text, based on Yamamoto's testimony and contemporary accounts, described what had happened. Visitors to the museum, mostly older Japanese who remember the war, baby boomers curious about their parents' silence, would stand before that photograph for long minutes. Some cried. Some simply nodded, as if confirming something they had always suspected. The younger visitors, teenagers dragged to the museum by history teachers, often seemed puzzled. Why would the Americans bow? Why would that matter? The dissent, usually retired teachers or historians, would explain, because it showed that honor was not what the empire had claimed it was, because it demonstrated that the enemy possessed virtues the propaganda had denied, because it forced a reckoning with the possibility that the war had been fought for lies, and that the people telling the lies had cared less about Japanese soldiers' dignity than the enemy did. It was a bitter lesson, made bearable only by time and distance and the prosperity that had followed. But it was also, in its way, a liberating lesson. If honor was not the exclusive possession of the Yamato race, if it was instead a human capacity that could manifest in any culture, then Japan's post-war transformation was not a betrayal but an expansion. The bow suggested that there were multiple ways to be honorable, multiple paths to dignity, and that defeat in war did not preclude victory in the longer struggle toward a decent society. The symbolic power of the bow endured precisely because it was so specific, so concrete, so irrefutable. It wasn't an abstract claim about democracy or freedom, concepts that could be debated endlessly. It was a physical action, witnessed by dozens of Japanese officers, repeated 73 times, photographed and documented and undeniable. Those American soldiers had bent to the waist and held a position, honoring the dead of an enemy nation, and nothing the old guard could say would erase that fact. In the landscape of post-war memory, where every fact was contested and every narrative served some political agenda, the bow stood as an awkward, irreducible truth. It didn't fit neatly into either the progressive narrative of American liberation or the conservative narrative of Japan's noble defeat. It was simply there, evidence that the enemy had been capable of honor, that they had chosen to express it even when military necessity didn't require it, and that this choice had mattered to the men who witnessed it. For Yamamoto, standing on that dock in January 1946, the bow had cracked something open that could never be fully sealed again. In that moment, as those young Americans bent to the waist to honor the Japanese dead, the entire architecture of imperial ideology had revealed itself as hollow. If the enemy could do this, could treat Japanese remains with more reverence than the imperial army had sometimes shown, then what had the war been for? What had the millions of deaths accomplished? What had the suffering purchased? These were not questions that Yamamoto could answer standing on the dock, watching casket after casket emerge from the ship's hold. They were questions that would occupy the rest of his life and the rest of Japan's post-war existence. But the bow had made them unavoidable. It had forced a confrontation with the possibility that Japan had been on the wrong side not just militarily but morally, that the defeat was not just bad fortune but justice, and that the occupation might be not humiliation but education. When the last casket was unloaded and the last bow completed, Captain Chen approached Yamamoto and asked, in Japanese, if there was anything else the U.S. military could do to assist with the repatriation. Yamamoto, still unable to fully speak, simply shook his head. Chen nodded, saluted, a Western military salute, crisp and formal, and turned to leave. Then he paused, looked back, and said, "We are all soldiers. We understand duty. We hope you can find peace." It was a strange benediction, coming from the victor to the vanquished, from the occupier to the occupied. But it carried weight because Chen was Nisei, because his family had likely been in an internment camp while Yamamoto was fighting in China, because his loyalty to America had been questioned while he proved it with his service. If Chen could extend this grace, this acknowledgement of shared humanity across the chasm of war, then perhaps the chasm was not unbridgeable. Yamamoto bowed in response. A bow deeper and longer than protocol required, a bow that acknowledged not just Chen's rank but the magnitude of what had just transpired. When he straightened, the American soldiers were already back on the LST, preparing to cast off. The Japanese officers began the work of loading the caskets onto trucks for distribution to families across the shattered nation. The harbor wind still cut cold across the water. The sky remained gray. But something had changed, something that would take years to fully articulate, but that began on that dock with the simple, devastating act of Americans bowing to honor the Japanese dead. In the decades that followed, that bow would become a touchstone, a reference point, a piece of evidence in the long argument about what the war had meant and what the post-war order represented. It would be invoked by progressives arguing for closer U.S.-Japan relations, by conservatives trying to articulate a form of Japanese honor compatible with democratic values, by educators trying to help students understand that history was more complicated than victims and villains. The bow would take on layers of meaning, accrue symbolic weight far beyond what those 6 American soldiers intended when they set down that first casket and bent at the waist. But at its core, the bow remained what it had always been, a simple gesture of respect, extended from the strong to the weak, from the victor to the vanquished, from the living to the dead. It was a kind of gesture that required no explanation for those who understood honor, and the kind that no explanation could fully convey to those who didn't. It was, in the end, proof that even in the aftermath of total war, even between enemies who had tried to annihilate each other, there remained the possibility of recognition, of seeing in the other not just an adversary but a human being deserving of dignity. That possibility, fragile and easily destroyed, was what the bow represented. It was what Yamamoto carried with him from the dock that January day, what he would remember in the years of reconstruction and transformation, what he would pass on in his own small ways to a generation trying to build something new from the ruins of the old. The Americans had won the war with their ships and planes and bombs, but they had won something more lasting with their willingness to bow, to acknowledge that even in victory, even in the absolute certainty of their power, the dead deserved honor and the defeated deserved to witness that honor being given. In a world that had spent 6 years learning new depths of cruelty, that small grace mattered. It suggested that war's end did not have to mean the end of humanity, that occupation did not require humiliation, that the gap between cultures was not unbridgeable. For Japan, still smoking and starving and shattered, that suggestion was the first seed of a future that would, against all expectations, grow into something that resembled peace. And it began with American soldiers bowing in the winter wind, honoring the dead of a nation they had defeated, proving that honor was not a prize to be won but a practice to be chosen, again and again, even when, especially when, no one would have faulted them for choosing otherwise.